If you have ever done any research on the First World War, you might have come across people saying that it was a family affair. And indeed, in the years leading up to the outbreak of war in 1914, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, three of the great European powers were ruled by cousins. King Emperor George V of Great Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all cousins, with George and Wilhelm being direct grandsons of Queen Victoria. And as described by the historian M.J. Carter in her book George, Nicholas and Wilhelm, together they presided over the last years of dynastic Europe and the outbreak of the most destructive war the world had ever seen, a war that set 20th century Europe on course to be the most violent continent in the history of the world. So in this video, I'll be doing a brief rundown of each of the three monarchs and why their family connections actually failed to stop World War I breaking out. Now, it must be said that other European rulers were also related to these three cousins in some way or another, mainly again through Queen Victoria, who is known as the grandmother of Europe, with the kings of Norway, Romania, Greece, Spain, and the Crown Prince of Sweden all being married to Victoria's granddaughters. Now, Victoria herself hoped that this complicated web of alliances and marriages would help keep Britain powerful and Europe peaceful, but once Victoria died in 1901, the family connections began to degrade and become less important to these cousins, and eventually it led to war. It wasn't enough to stop the outbreak of war in 1914. Now, the first monarch we're going to have a look at here is George V, the big one, the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and Emperor of India. He became King Emperor in 1910 after the death of his father, King Edward VII, and ruled until his death in 1936, serving as a solid figurehead for the nations of the British Empire through the First World War. It is well regarded that he and his wife, Queen Mary of Teck, provided inspiration and support for both the armed forces and civilian populations throughout the war through hundreds of official visits and their own family service and self-sacrifice. Unlike his continental cousins, King George V was a purely constitutional monarch, possessing only the rights to be consulted, to encourage and to warn. He had no direct absolute power as a constitutional monarch. And in the days before the war was actually declared, King George V tried to urge restraint, but having no actual power, it was to no avail. And ironically, the only time the king did successfully intervene with his government during the war to encourage a change of government policy was when he actually persuaded Prime Minister David Lloyd George to take back the offer of sanctuary made to the deposed Tsar Nicholas II in 1917 in response to a request from the government in St. Petersburg, a decision I'm sure he came to regret. That brings me on, indeed, to Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, ruling from 1895 to 1917, when he was deposed and his entire family was killed by the Bolsheviks after the October Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia. Nicholas II succeeded his father, Tsar Alexander III, but it is often posited that he did not have the upbringing or the temperament to succeed in the role as emperor. It was an autocratic ruler in Russia rather than a constitutional monarch like in the United Kingdom, where the monarchy is limited by the powers of parliament. In Russia, the role of Tsar was an autocratic ruler. Nicholas II received a military education from his tutor. He was not brought up necessarily in the way that one would want to be a ruler rather than a military officer. George V and Nicholas II, Britain and Russia were of course on the same side of World War I. They were both part of the Triple Entente, with Russia entering World War I in support of Serbia originally after the attack from Austria-Hungary. During the war, Russia did have some success against Austria-Hungary, but then suffered major defeats by Germany until, of course, 1917, when they had the Russian Revolution and the provisional government signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Now this brings me on to the third monarch we're going to be talking about today, and that is Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Wilhelm was the last German emperor and king of Prussia from 1888 until his abdication after World War I in 1918, marking the end of the German Empire and the 300-year rule of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, Wilhelm encouraged the Austro-Hungarian Empire to adopt an uncompromising line against the Serbians, effectively writing them a blank check for German support in the event of a war breaking out. France and Britain entered the war against Germany and Austria after Austria-Hungary took this uncompromising stance and invaded Serbia, who themselves actually fought back fairly well against Austria-Hungary. Wilhelm then, of course, found himself excluded from military decisions, and some describe him as a bit of a lame duck, but due to his grandiose support for his generals and politicians, he scuppered many chances for a compromise peace with the Allies, therefore leading to the crippling Treaty of Versailles in 1919, after Germany and the Central Powers were defeated in 1918. So why was it that these family connections couldn't stop World War I then? Why couldn't these cousin monarchs prevent the outbreak of war? Well, would it surprise you to know that the King of Great Britain, George V, and the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, actually had quite a warm and cordial relationship, but in contrast, the king didn't have as much as a good relationship with Wilhelm II. He had a polite relationship, but it wasn't all that warm. It wasn't as warm as with the Tsar of Russia, who he actually bore quite a strong resemblance with. I'll put the pictures up on the screen. They look very much alike, and he referred to him as Cousin Nicky, as opposed to Wilhelm II, who he referred to in private as William the Fidgety, never going further than having a polite relationship with the Kaiser of Germany. And one of the main reasons that is argued that these monarchs were unable to stop the outbreak of war in World War I is that Wilhelm II didn't want to stop the outbreak of war. So, of course, we've already talked about briefly that King George V of Great Britain was a constitutional monarch. He did not have that much power over the day-to-day ruling of the country. He didn't have enough power to influence his government not to declare war, and after the whole thing unravelled with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Britain had made their promises and thus they entered the war. Kaiser Wilhelm II, on the other hand, did have the power. Now, it is well known that Kaiser Wilhelm did want to expand Germany. He had a competing ideology with Great Britain. He wanted Germany to have a greater global reach, a greater Germany, and they wanted to also challenge the naval supremacy of Great Britain, and this is where the relationship between Germany and Britain really starts to break down. Actually, before World War I, in the years leading up to that, they didn't have that much of a sour relationship until the point at which Germany wanted to challenge Britain for naval supremacy. There were also national rivalries and the sheer and seemingly unstoppable momentum of militarism that was sweeping across Europe at this time, and then as the arms race developed, generals and admirals made plans in Germany that became more and more aggressive, and Kaiser Wilhelm, as I said before, gave German military leaders and officials and politicians his support for an aggressive approach. In short, far from being one to reduce tensions and reduce the chance of an outbreak of war in 1914, Wilhelm was actually seen as one of the main instigators of militaristic policies that then went on to fuel the conflict. And as I mentioned earlier, his support for Austria-Hungary taking that uncompromising stance set the stage for war. So as much as the three main leaders of the great European powers were cousins, it could be argued that despite the familial connection, there was not much that either of the other monarchs could do to try and defuse the situation after Germany and Wilhelm were fixated on militarism. One even wonders if the war could have been stopped if it weren't for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, of course. This is one of the most talked about theories of alternate history out there, but some historians say it wouldn't have even mattered. There was an unstoppable wave of German aggressiveness and militarism for wanting to expand into a greater Germany. Of course, there are many theories out there, so take all of these with a pinch of salt. You can decide for yourself what you think would have happened, but we will never know for sure. Russia too, like Germany, in the end actually had a fairly weak ruler in reality, but one that nonetheless held extreme power, and Nicholas II had a fear of appearing weak. He hesitated, but in the end gave way to his own war party and ordered the general mobilization that made war with Germany inevitable. So we have these two sides of the coin, Germany and Russia, who are actually fairly similar in the way that their rulers are fairly weak in reality, with their politicians and war parties gaining influence over them to make the decisions that that they want, with the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar wielding this great power, this absolute monarchical power, in a way that best accommodates the ideas and the ideology of their respective military officials. Britain was the only one that, had it intervened early enough, might have actually been able to stop the war from ever happening in the first place, but King George V not only urged restraint, he actually had no constitutional power anyway, so it might not have made much of a difference anyway. This is all coming around to me saying that, in my opinion, I'm not sure if there was anything that these monarchs could have done to prevent the war from happening, given that Kaiser Wilhelm was an out-and-out militarist wanting a greater Germany and gave his support to his military officials. Tsar Nicholas II was so fearful of seeming weak that he gave in to his own war party and prepared a general mobilization of the Russian army, and George V in Britain had no real constitutional power over the power of Parliament, who then intervened in Europe anyway. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. What do you guys think in the comments down below? Do you have any theories? Do you have any alternate scenarios in which the monarchs could have come together, maybe at a joint conference or something like that? Or do you think the war was inevitable? Because in my mind, there was no way that Wilhelm II would not want to declare war at some point. What do you guys think about that? Let me know in the comments down below. Get those in. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe. And as always, thank you very much for watching.